Open a doorway to healing in your life. I'm your host, Dawn Damari. Hi, I'm Dawn Damari, and you're listening to another episode of A Teaspoon of Healing. I'm very happy to introduce my guest today, Jason Earle. He is the founder and CEO of Got Mold. Hi, Jason.
Hi, Dawn.
Thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast today.
So good to be here.
So, Got Mold, we will talk about that in a little bit. I wanted to know, I read a little bit about your story. How did you get into, for the lack of a better word, the mold business? I saw that you were in Wall Street, and it looked like you did have some experiences growing up with childhood asthma. So I'm wondering how you got into to how you did your career change. What made you decide to do this?
It's a common question. I think mold there's no academic track for what we do. Mm-hmm. And most of the people who are in this space that do really good work tend to come from a personal experience. I see this with lots of areas where there's healing involved, and once people get over their own mountain, then they've reached their hand back, and that's the case with this. Mold is actually a fairly nascent industry, if you will. It's only been really mold inspections, mold remediation only for the past 20 years or so. And I've been in it for about that long. So I got into the business out of pure curiosity, really. I was, as you mentioned previously, on Wall Street. I started on Wall Street when I was really young, at 16, and then at 25, I had enough. And I decided that I wanted to go do something meaningful with my life without really a clue as to what that meant. But I did have some space and some time, and I went traveling for a while. And back then, I brought a journal and some CDs. I'm dating myself here, and went on sort of a walkabout for about a year and a half. While I was away, I was doing a lot of reading. I happened to be in Hawaii for a bit of that trip, and I was reading about a huge mold problem that was in the Hilton Kalia Tower, which is the flagship property. Hilton's flagship property in Oahu. And the building had been shut down for a number of months at that point for this huge mold problem that initially they thought to be relatively small. But as they began opening the walls, it was like Pandora's box. It went from a $500,000 problem to a $5 million problem to a $55 million problem. Anyway, long story short, it was a huge mold issue, and a lot of people got sick from the building, or at least people were saying that they thought they got sick. And this is before mold illness was really in any of the headlines. This is around 2001 into 2002. And so there was one particular story that caught my attention. It was a man in his 40s who worked there who developed adult onset asthma, which is something I'd never heard of. And he also developed all these sensitivities to food and the environment. So things that he'd always been fine with. And so it was like a deja vu moment for me. And suddenly I'm thinking about my childhood, because when I was around 4 years old, I lost a bunch of weight in a 3-week period. My parents brought me to the doctor, and he said, you should really take him to Children's Hospital, get him worked up. And so the first diagnosis was cystic fibrosis, which was obviously devastating, especially back then. It was a terminal illness. And my father had 4 cousins who died of CF before the age of 14. So it hit really close to home. Second round of tests, or the second opinion, confirmed I did not have CF. Thank goodness, and evidenced by the fact that I sit here at 45 years old. But actually, I had asthma compounded by pneumonia. And when they did allergy tests on me, back then, I don't know how they do it now, but I was kind of in a papoose, or like a straitjacket for a toddler. And then they drew a grid on my back and put the antigens on. And my dad just said I looked like a ladybug, a big red swollen back with dots all over it, And so I was allergic to everything in my environment: grass, wheat, corn, eggs, dogs, cats, cotton, soybeans. And I grew up on a little non-working farm outside of Princeton, New Jersey, surrounded by dogs, cats, grass, wheat, corn, eggs, cotton, soybeans, everything. And so grew up basically on inhalers, and always felt better when I was outside the house. Never really understood why. But here I am in Hawaii, and I'm reading this article, and I'm thinking, geez, I wonder if the house I grew up in made me sick. I called my dad from a payphone. He answered, and I told him what I was thinking. I said, do you think we had a mold problem? And he goes, Jason, we had freaking mushrooms in the basement. Of course we had mold. I mean, why do you ask? And it was just so of course we had mold. it just the back then they were also they're smokers, and and they smoked
Mm-hmm.
indoors, and of course even in the car with an asthmatic kid, the awareness about these things was like zero.
Mm-hmm.
So anyway, it was immediate for me. I just thought, I said, do you think that was what made me sick? And he said, well, it couldn't have helped. There you go. So it's very clear in retrospect. We had a very damp basement. Water would run through when it rained. It was, we should have stocked it for trout. There was a lot of dampness down there. I mean, I remember going down there and feeling the weight and the pressure, but I didn't connect it directly to an environmental cause, certainly not mold in particular. But then immediately on that, I immediately became passionately interested in the idea that buildings can make you sick. Just the idea that the interaction or the nexus between buildings and health became immediately fascinating to me. And I grew up in a medical and construction family, so I guess that kind of works, right?
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So I was doing construction with my uncle in a small construction company, and I worked with him after school and in the summers. And then my mom and my aunts and my grandmother was one of the first women to be admitted to medical school. And so I was, and she got a full ride. She turned it down to go pack parachutes for World War II for my grandfather, who, by the way, today's Veterans Day. I know it's,
Yeah.
and I heard your piece about your grandfather. So, yeah.
Oh, thank you.
So yeah, no, it was a medical and construction family, and so I kind of landed right in the middle of that. And so I came back from Hawaii, raring to go, curious, and I found a company doing mold remediation. There weren't very many. They were also doing basement waterproofing, and I took a job working for them in sales, and they thought, well, what's this guy from Wall Street doing here? But I was really curious about. I mean, there was no standard. There was no industry standard. There were no certifications at the time, no regulations. And so what I saw quickly was that these guys were doing shoddy work, lots of chemicals, very little actual cleaning, often leaving buildings worse. And so I started an inspection company in the evenings because I recognized that there was a need for the consumer to be protected from the contractors. All environmental hazards have this separation between the inspectors and the remediators, whether it's lead paint or asbestos. And so mold didn't have that. And I thought for sure that would happen one day. And so I decided to plant my feet firmly on one side and avoid a conflict of interest. And so we started a company called Lab Results, where we started using Labrador retrievers that were specially trained to sniff out hidden mold in buildings. And that turned into a successful company where we ended up on Good Morning America and Extreme Makeover Home Edition and all sorts of national news because of a few stories of healing, where we went into homes where the children were where they weren't doing well, they weren't responding to traditional treatment for asthma and other mysterious illnesses, and we went and found hidden mold, got it fixed, and suddenly they were healed. Not only did they get better, but suddenly family members who didn't think they were sick got better. The whole house healed, and these stories put us on the national circuit for a while, and then that company became 1-800-GOT-MOLD. Which is our mold inspection business. But what we've done since then is really looked at and said, the biggest problem with this industry is that the inspections are cost prohibitive. It's very difficult to find a qualified professional, especially one that doesn't have a conflict of interest. There's information on the internet is 99% misinformation. First thing I tell people to do is don't read, don't go to Facebook with mold questions. But basically we looked at what we were doing with 1-800-GOT-MOLD and all the people that we'd helped, and realized that we weren't helping the people who needed us the most. And so for the last 10 years plus, I've worked to put together a do-it-yourself test kit that would allow people to cost effectively test their air without having to hire or find a qualified professional to get the same quality results, but without the aggravation. And so that's what we did with the GOT-MOLD test kit, which is at gotmold.com, which we're excited to announce that we just recently made public. So that gives people the ability to very, very easily and affordably take a quick snapshot and see what's actually floating around in their air. And this will give people the tools that they need to be able to make better decisions about the air they breathe.
Oh, great. Now to get back to mold itself. So there's a lot of misconceptions. There's a lot of misinformation, of course. So I guess just getting to the basics. I know this is going to sound like a silly question. What is mold? What is the, I guess, dangerous type of mold? I'm assuming there's many different types of mold. I took microbiology, but it's been a while. So please excuse me. I probably am getting a few terms wrong, but you hear about black mold, you hear about most buildings do have some mold in them no matter what. I think almost all buildings. So I guess what is it, and
Sure.
what is the harmful kind of mold, and how does it harm your health?
Sure, there's a lot there because within that there's all these wives' tales and
Hmm.
myths and
Yeah.
misconceptions, and there it's like
I
it's
guess how
like
to narrow this down.
yeah. So starting at
It
the
was just
beginning is the
just the
best. So mold,
basics.
what
Yeah.
is mold,
What is
right?
it? Yeah. What is
So
mold?
so mold is a type of fungi, a type of fungus
Hmm.
that is nature's great recycler. And so, in essence, mold's job is to take things that were at one time living and turn them back into dirt. It does a really good job of
Oh.
taking stuff outside, like leaves and twigs and all the organic matter. And when I say organic, I'm not talking about the
Hmm.
grocery store.
Yeah.
Anything that's comprised, it's carbon based, that at
Hmm.
one time was respiring, was living.
Hmm.
The mold breaks that stuff down. And so if we didn't have mold, we would have dead trees. In fact, there was a period in history that way back when, which is where all the coal came from, where we didn't have these microbes, and trees piled up. They grew up, they
Oh,
fell down, and they did not decay. And
I didn't know
that was
that.
one of nature's great lessons. That's where we get coal from. Yeah.
Oh,
Um,
okay.
yeah, it just didn't decay. So anyway, we have this world filled with fungi, and one particular type of it is mold.
Hmm.
And so mold is a normal part of our environment when it's doing what it's supposed to do outside, or
Hmm.
flavoring our foods, because mold also produces soy sauce and antibiotics and all sorts of
Right.
other really delicious and helpful things. But when mold grows indoors, it causes problems. And
Hmm.
so that's the distinction. Now, every house has mold, true, because mold spores are literally everywhere on the face of your watch, on your eyeglasses. As you breathe right now, you're breathing in tens of thousands, if not more, in every breath that you take, and without
Oh
any
no.
effect, by the way, without any
Oh, okay.
effect.
Okay.
What happens is mold is very complex. It produces lots of different things when it digests, just like we do,
Hmm.
right? So
Right.
one of the things it produces is that musty odor. Some people lovingly call
Hmm.
them mold burps. Some people call them mold farts. But the point is that everyone refers to them in a gaseous fashion. And so bottom line is that mold produces, as it's digesting, digestive byproducts that can also make you ill. The musty odor is directly correlated to, is directly linked to lots and lots of different ailments. In particular, it's the number one. It's the number two. It's number two behind maternal smoking in terms of the prediction of childhood asthma. And just the presence of the musty odor, having children in the presence of the musty odor, and it doubles the asthma risk in otherwise healthy children. And it also triggers immune responses in sensitive individuals, asthma attacks, sinus issues, things like that. And also, there's a direct link between exposure, chronic mold exposure, and chemical sensitivity development. And
Really?
people who have chemical sensitivities cannot be around the mold smell because it's comprised of very similar chemicals that you would find in industrial refineries. Yeah, like benzene and
Oh.
lots of aldehydes and alcohols and things like that. So yeah, no, VOCs that are man-made look a lot very similar to microbial VOCs, which is what that musty smell is. People talk about mycotoxins a lot, which is another thing that mold
Hmm.
produces when it's growing. Mycotoxins, some molds produce them sometimes, and so that's one of the many myths, is that we have to worry about the mycotoxins. You don't. You have to worry about dampness, because mold won't grow if there's no dampness. At the end of the day, mold is a moisture problem. Everybody wants to vilify mold. Mold's just doing its thing. If you
Hmm.
do your job, then and manage the building and don't have moisture problems develop, or if one does develop, you deal with it quickly, you won't have a problem. More and more these days, I'm using the body as the building as an organism, or
Hmm.
building as a body metaphor,
Hmm.
because mold is like inflammation.
Right.
It's
Okay.
not the problem. It's not the problem.
It's like a
And if you
response.
treat the problem, you're going to miss the mark. And treating
Right.
inflammation is a mistake,
Hmm.
right? Inflammation
Right.
has a purpose. And now, if you have chronic inflammation, you have an underlying chronic condition potentially. You
Hmm.
need to deal with that, and that's moisture. So mold and moisture are symptom cause. See. And so it's very important that you keep your eye on the prize. Mold is just doing its thing. And by the way, the molds that produce the biggest toxins, FYI, It's really interesting. The metaphor plays all the way through because the first molds that grow are usually fairly just benign, allergenic. And as you go up, as the water problem continues, you have secondary colonizers. They come in and eat the first guys, and then the third stage are the guys that have the really aggressive chemical weapons. Those are the mycotoxins. They come in and kill the other molds and eat them. And
Oh,
that's really why they produce the mycotoxins. These guys are doing chemical warfare on a microscopic level, and we get caught in the crosshairs. It's fascinating stuff, really.
it really is. So they're
Yeah.
just there's now. Are there different kinds of mold? You hear about black mold, and then there's some of them. Sometimes you see residue that's different colored, like orange or white. Are there different types that and
It,
more dangerous than others, or is it just a proliferation of more of the same kind of mold?
it's exactly like I said. So you've got this curve, if you will, or this,
Right.
you've got what they call primary or the first colonized, the first crew that shows up to the
Okay.
to the party. It's a pool party. You've got a moisture problem. Okay.
Right.
And
Right.
the first guys that show up, they come in, they're dressed pretty light. They're just going to have a good time. And then the second guys come in, they've got luggage, man. They're going to come in and they're going to set up camp. And the third ones that come in, they come in armed because they're taking over and they're prepared to take your building down. They think that all the other ones are just nibbling at the edges. The most aggressive molds are the ones that are coming in to take your building back down to dirt. And so, and they're the ones that produce these mycotoxins. And
Okay.
so really like I said, it's inflammation. The chronic long term, where you have chronic inflammation, your tissue will break down, right? So
Hmm.
same thing goes with mold. It's really, it's that simple. So if you see something, if you smell something, or you feel something, then do something. So I always say the first step is, do you have mold, right? Our name is Got Mold with a question mark because
Hmm.
that's what people ask. And so we always say, first thing you have to do is, if you're curious about this, if you see something, that means if you see any visible evidence of discoloration or a strange
Hmm.
texture or
Yeah.
speckling, right? That's what any blistering paint, peeling, trim
Oh.
pulling away, these kinds of
Uh-oh.
things, right? Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
I'm looking
Um,
at some.
Condensation around windows, especially in the wintertime.
Hmm.
Anytime you see any black speckles, but this is also colors of mold don't really matter because some of the
But I was
black
wondering if there's orange or,
mhm,
I've seen in different houses throughout the years. So
every color.
I've never really seen black. Okay. So, I've heard about it. Okay. So it doesn't really matter what color, it's still mold and it's still
Yeah,
going to be a problem. Okay.
there's a whole one of those categories of myths and misconceptions is toxic mold / black mold, which is that
Yeah,
there's some sort
exactly.
of a mold that you're going to treat differently because it's got and that's a red herring, if you will.
Okay.
The reality is that this mold is you will remediate it the same way. It doesn't change anything. There are some physicians um, and, and some questionable healthcare quasi professionals that will treat those things differently,
Oh,
and
okay.
and so they'll work with different detoxifying elements to help remove these toxins, and with questionable results. It just depends.
Oh, okay.
It
Okay.
depends on the practitioner and et cetera. But anyway, the bottom line is that you really, at the end of the day, a moisture problem is a mold problem. Remediation is the same. The testing, the inspection is the same. What the different molds tell you is the degree or the extent that problem has. It's really more of a forensic situation. So if you've got those late stage colonizers, that means you've had a long term problem. And so it's more of you can tell if you've had a chronic long term problem by the types of molds that you have, more so than allowing that to dictate any of your behavior. Right.
Okay. Okay. So
And
if,
part of the reason, let me just add to that because I think it's important. Part of the reason why people who have chronic mold exposure, and I'm speaking to probably a good number of people who listen to your podcast, because mold related illness is extremely common, and it's something that people uh, don't always understand until after they've been through it and they realize that it played a part in some other illnesses. And anyway, the bottom line is, if you have these molds, you have chronic dampness in your house.
hmm
Chances are that means you have chronic exposure to these molds. So it's not the mold that's so bad. It's the chronic dampness and the
hmm
chronic exposure. See, You know what I mean? So
Yeah.
and so it's if you just walk into a house with a mold problem, your symptoms will be acute. Usually, you'll just have a
Yes. I've
but
had that happen before. Walked into we were looking at rentals once, and there was one house, and I remember walking in, and I'm somebody that has post-viral asthma and occasional asthma, but it's definitely flared up and I walked in and my throat closed up. I couldn't, I was gasping, the typical stuff, and it was just so weird that it can be so acute.
yes. And
Okay,
everybody
so
different too, by the way. You can have 5 people living in a house with a mold problem. Everybody has different symptoms.
now a quick question. So you're talking about, dampness. So some people that are listening to this, they live where I live. I live in a beach town in California, and it is definitely moist here, even though it's Southern California. They say it's a desert. Well, it's not necessarily where I live, and a lot of the houses are quite old and funky, which is really cool. However, so I'm assuming there's mold. I mean, I guess if you know that the place you live is damp, just like people who live in the southeast, where it's very humid all the time, Florida, etc. So you just know you're living in a moist environment, and you have buildings that are older, so they're leaky. So how do you solve the dampness? What do you do?
So that's a great question, and and I'll do my best to give an answer that will apply to everyone, which is that you adapt. Humans are capable of living in every single climate without harm if they use best practices designed for those climates.
Okay.
So what you wouldn't build the same way. I live in Minnesota right now. This is a very extreme climate. So you get a
Yeah.
lot of, especially in the wintertime where you've got this extreme cold, and so you end up with condensation in strange areas. And
Mhm.
and your condensation here turns into ice. I actually had a moisture problem in a basement in a house that we rented when we first moved out here last year from New York. And the moisture problem in the basement turned into ice, into frozen windowsills. I'm not even
Oh my
kidding. It
goodness.
looked like a freezer
Wow.
inside, and then the humidity got straightened out, and it just slowly evaporated. There was not even a stain left on the windowsill. It was just really, for a guy who studies building science, it was a remarkable observation in my own
Hmm.
house. But so you wouldn't build the same way in Minnesota that you would build in Florida, because moisture moves
Right.
differently and the humidity levels are different inside and outside, whether it's a heating climate or a cooling climate. So, but the bottom line is, in every climate there are techniques for that, and there are books written about these things. So each area,
Oh.
but yeah, I mean, there's a whole series by the Building Science Institute, Joseph Stieberek. Uh, he goes into every single different climate and the different different configurations of building materials and things like that. And so the bottom line is, it is being done successfully wherever you live.
Okay.
The question is, are you doing it successfully? And so,
Probably not.
and so really what it comes down to is, you want to engage your senses in all cases. You want to, really make sure that you've got your eyes open. You're looking for any source of moisture problems at any time. If you smell anything, that's the first clue. The musty smell is
Hmm.
the dead giveaway.
Okay.
And I always say, trust your senses, but then get the facts. So you want to do things like get humidity gauges, get temperature gauges. I like to get the kinds of gauges that you can put like a base station in your kitchen, like the ones made by Oregon Scientific and these kinds of companies. And
Hmm.
then you can put the sensors in different places that you might not go to all the time, like your crawl space and your basement and maybe outside. So, if you need to throw a coat on before you go get the newspaper. And so you get to be familiar with the different sort of microclimates within your home, and you start to pay attention, and you know that you got to keep your humidity above 40%, but lower than 60%. That's the safe zone, according to ASHRAE, which is the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers. So 40 and 60% is the range. You want to keep your humidity ideally around 45%. Much above that, you start to get mold and or condensation and other critters that like dampness.
Hmm.
Like dust mites and things like that. And much below that, you start to dry out and you become susceptible to, airborne infections. And so the
Oh.
bottom, right? So if you think about it, people get dry in the wintertime, and everyone gets sick. And it's because their
Hmm.
mucous membranes allow for pathogens to make it through. It's not because they got cold. And it's really because they got dry. And so moisture is this fine balance, right? Mold loves the
Hmm.
same stuff we love. It doesn't, and it likes the temperature. It likes the stuff we like to build with. It likes to eat it. It likes the moisture that we like to have, and it likes it because we don't know how to manage it well. And as soon as it gets a little
Hmm.
damp, those spores are already there waiting to grow. So the only thing in this whole thing that you can control is moisture. And so
Right.
that's the only thing you can control. And there is no mold prevention. There's no paint. There's no encapsulant. There's no pill, potion, or spray. The bottom
Mhm.
line is it's moisture control. So if you live in a damp climate, you're going to want to make sure that your air conditioner is actually doing its job and you're dehumidifying appropriately. If you're living in places where you've got a lot of groundwater, you want to make sure your building drains properly. And you want to make sure that you don't have any intrusion. It's a vigilance that you have to employ. And I'll leave you with another thought on this, which is that I look at the building as an extension of your immune system. Look at it as an exoskeleton or an exoskin. We're disconnected from nature already, but we have to
Yes.
recognize that the buildings that we live in are a basic human need. It's air, water, food, shelter. It's just not an optional thing here, and this is not a luxury. This is a necessity. And because it's a necessity, and because we do have our domain of control over it, we should exercise that control. And so develop a relationship with your home. Understand when it starts to have aches and pains, because that's where the moisture problems develop. Wherever the building is starting to break down, right? This is a symbiotic relationship that I'm encouraging people to consider.
I really like that. And so, because like you mentioned, it's a basic need, shelter. And we just really need to treat it like a symbiotic relationship and just stay on top of it. And it's really interesting as, public health science and science develops, they're starting to realize, how much, the built environment and buildings contribute to health, and sick buildings and people who live in hurricane zones and so forth. And so it's really good that people are finally realizing this. So I guess back to mold, you mentioned asthma, you mentioned other conditions. What are some other tip-offs that somebody might have an issue with it? Maybe some people are not as affected by it and they can live around mold and just be like, whatever, there's mold here. And some people are going to be very susceptible.
Yeah, and it does impact everybody differently. As I mentioned, you can have 5 people living in a house, and they all have 5 different
Okay.
health profiles, if you will. And it's interesting because there's going to be the hypersensitive person who's usually the one looking for, they're usually the ones that call us. And then there's usually someone who is experiencing no discomfort, zero,
Okay.
at least so they
Wow.
say. And then
Uh-huh.
there's various different symptoms in between. And so, the most common stuff is upper respiratory, typical,
Mhm.
hay fever-like symptoms. Of course, asthma-like symptoms, extremely common. And then you get, some dermal sensitivity. Some people develop hives, itchy eyes, those kinds of sort of more acute symptoms that will go away shortly thereafter. But then you also have some of the more nebulous ones, especially coming from the musty odor, like headaches, nausea, dizziness, fatigue, difficulty concentrating, cognitive impairment. A lot of people claim that the mycotoxins do that, but you just need the musty smell; that'll do it just fine. Remember, the alcohol is produced by fungi, right?
Mhm.
So
Right.
you're breathing in the byproducts. You're breathing in these fumes, in essence,
Mhm.
really.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
these cognitive impairments that people report are, also dream disturbances, sleep disturbances, very difficult
Wow.
when you sleep in a musty home. You won't smell it, by the way. You'll only notice it when you walk in, and then your odor receptors get numb to it, essentially, and so you won't even smell it. But all of you also have elevated heart rate. Some people have arrhythmias. It creates a fight or flight response. Remember also that we are trained. We are as an evolutionary advantage. We are repelled by these things. So it's
Mhm.
the same way that you repel when you smell vomit or feces or any of that stuff.
Right.
Our body goes, whoa, keep that away
Mhm.
from me, because mold is the first stage of decay. And
Yes.
and so we know viscerally from however many generations ago that stuff causes illness, and so it creates a panic response in some people. And they can have incredible anxiety from it. Mold rage is actually a thing, believe it or not.
Wow.
Yeah, no, and people who PTSD like symptoms. I mean, people really end up, and then it's also a loop, because they get angry and they get panicky, just like with asthma, it's a loop, right? So the
Yes.
panic creates the restriction and
Mhm.
the whole thing. So it's very, very similar. The other, there's some more extreme cases where, people have chronic exposure. I mean, people have had all sorts of illnesses that they link to mold exposure. But the other thing that's really important, probably for a lot of your listeners, is that Lyme disease, which more people were diagnosed with Lyme disease last year than breast cancer, and it's only in 14 states. But there's an overlap with mold, with the mold sensitive. And there's some research that a few doctors have promoted that talks about a genetic marker, a genetic mutation, MTHFR. But regardless, there's an overlap there that's very, very powerful, and that people who have Lyme, and you see a lot of gut dysbiosis, a lot of antibiotic use, these sensitivities overlap and reinforce each other. And that's what I went through. It was mold, antibiotics from Lyme disease, and then chemical sensitivities. And that whole thing is just like it's a snowball that starts at the top of the mountain. And by the time you get down, it's hard to parse out what happened. But they all overlap and they all amplify each other. And so the first step is you got to, before you detox, you got to make sure you don't retox and stop exposure, and then see how things sort of unfold after that. But that connection between mold and Lyme is powerful.
That's really fascinating. All of this is. Now, can it also exacerbate allergies to other things? I know you mentioned dust mites. My son has a dust mite allergy, and I'm assuming that's just, it gets worse when it's moist. So I don't know if it's mold has any relation to that too or not.
Well, dust mites are kissing cousins. Actually, dust mites eat mold spores, and if you look at them under the microscope, you can see them there are pictures with scanning electron microscopes of dust mites noshing on spores. So when you test for the allergen, a lot of the it's the dust mite fecal pellets that you're actually really reacting to. So you're talking about mold and dust mites and all sorts of delicious stuff. And so that's all based on moisture. Dust mites go into basically like stasis when there's not enough moisture, or if it gets below, I want to say 70 degrees and 60% humidity. They just kind of go into they freeze, and then they reanimate and they come out and just do their thing. So yeah, dust mites and mold, same thing. They're the early guests. They're the first ones to get the invitation to the pool party. And so, but the other thing is that, as I mentioned before, when I was a kid, I was severely allergic to everything. The interesting part is now most of my referrals through 1-800-GOT-MOLD come from physicians. So we get a lot of referrals from doctors with patients that aren't responding to traditional treatments, and so I've told my story a million times and they've all heard it. And so many of them have tested me for allergies to see that for themselves. And I'm not allergic to anything anymore. So anything, nothing, zero. So now I was allergic to everything. So how does that happen? Well, for me, it's in retrospect, of course, it's anecdotal, that chronic exposure, that chronic long-term exposure made everything that I was potentially sensitive to come to the surface. And so my immune system was on high alert. So anything you threw at it, it was just going to say, invader. And now, absent that chronic exposure, I don't have any symptoms of any such sensitivities. So it's kind of like it's like Stephen Covey with the big rocks. Have you ever heard that one? Take care of the big thing first. And for me, clearly it was the mold.
Great. Well, that's really good to know that there's hope. So now if somebody wants to test their house for mold, but rather than going to one of these inspectors that are really expensive and remediation companies before all that, so they can order your product. And
go to gotmold.com.
Okay.
You can get either a 1 or 2 or 3 room kit. They start at $149. And that includes all lab fees, all shipping. So there's no hidden fees, no surprises. And we work with MLab-P&K, so we have an exclusive relationship with them, which is the #1 lab in the country. And they so you get an AIHA accredited laboratory analysis, which is the same exact analysis that professionals use, but for a fraction of the cost. But if you want to look for professionals, I will give some advice, because I think there's a time. In fact, the test kit does not replace a professional. Make sure that you find someone who's independent. It's extremely important. Make sure they're not in the remediation business and that their brother isn't in it either. Okay. And you also want to make sure that they're not going to, that they advocate a green clean. So that means that even because they're going to do an inspection, They're not doing remediation, but the job of an inspector is actually to design the remediation plan and to put it in writing to provide a scope of work. And so they need to spec out exactly what's to be done and what's not to be done. And the number one thing is no chemicals, especially for people who have the kinds of sensitivities we talked about before. There's no place for chemicals in mold remediation ever, but it's especially important for people to have these sensitivities. There's already enough chemicals going on produced by the mold growth. And then the other part is that you want to make sure that they help you select the contractor, but again, that they don't have a financial relationship with them. So, and that they'll come back at the end of it and do the requisite testing and inspection to make sure that you've gotten what you paid for. And above all, you want to make sure that they're properly trained and certified. IICRC is the mold remediation certification training organization that we recommend. Make sure the people, the company, and the workers are certified. That's a common mistake. They'll send in uncertified workers. And then when it comes to inspectors, you really want somebody who's got a broader sort of building science background, not just a mold inspector or a home inspector type. You want somebody who really has more of a building biology, building science, somebody who's an environmental consultant. And that's why they're hard to find. Most people just look at mold inspector and they end up with a Tom, Dick, or Harry that just got a certification for $199 on the internet.
Okay.
So that's why we created the mold test kit, because it's hard to find a qualified professional. There's also at our website, we've got a learning center filled with lots of information. We have a free ebook that we make available to us. In fact, for your listeners, we have a page where we put up gotmold.com/teaspoon.
Okay. And
there you can get a copy of that ebook, which is how to find mold. It's 45 pages of inspection checklists and FAQs, and it's a valuable document. Lots of people give us rave reviews on that, and also a link so that your listeners can get a 10% discount on Got Mold Test Kit through that page.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me today on the podcast and talking about mold. And it's actually so important. It's so amazing at how many things it's connected to, and I really appreciate it.
Yeah, I this is water, right? There's this idea that we are farsighted. We tend to look at things that are so far away, but the thing that we need the most, that we do 24,000 times a day, we breathe, we don't do it consciously enough. And so by bringing these things to people's attention, they can start to, like I said, make better decisions about the air they breathe. So hopefully that's what will come out of today.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Jason, for joining me on A Teaspoon of Healing. And if any listeners have any questions, they can direct them to me and I will direct their questions to you.
Yeah, you can also, they can go to gotmold.com. We have a contact, They have a section at the bottom of the homepage where we encourage people to ask questions. You can also send questions to questions@gotmold.com. We have people that are there to answer.
Wonderful. Well, great. And thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Dawn.
Susan, you remember the time we were in Orange County? We were driving around and we got lost, and we ran into this place called
Avila's El Ranchito.
You remember the place? The place had awesome decor and authentic margaritas.
Did you know that Avila's El Ranchito has been around since 1966? They have 13 locations throughout Orange County. Visit Salvador Avila's location in Lake Forest and Foothill Ranch for great food, ambiance, and specialty margaritas.
This podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute medical advice. Please consult a physician or other health professional before undertaking changes in lifestyle or wellness habits. The author claims no responsibility to any person or entity for any liability, loss, or damage caused or alleged to be caused directly or indirectly as a result of the use, application, or interpretation of the information presented herein.